In October 1923, a German housewife wheeled a barrow of banknotes to a bakery in Weimar, Berlin. The barrow held 4 billion marks. She left it outside while she went in to buy bread. When she returned, someone had stolen the barrow. They left the money on the pavement. It wasn't worth carrying. That is what happens when the promise breaks. Right now, the United States carries $38 trillion in debt. The European Union owes $14 trillion, Japan nearly $9 trillion, Saudi Arabia, Germany, China. Every nation on earth, regardless of ideology, regardless of resource wealth, regardless of trade surplus, carries debt. Every single one. And that raises a question nobody in mainstream finance wants to answer clearly. If every country on earth owes money, who exactly do they owe it to? The answer will unsettle you. Not because it reveals a hidden villain, because it reveals there isn't one. To understand how the world arrived here, at $315 trillion in total global debt, nearly 3 times the size of everything humanity produces in a year, you have to go back to a single room in London in the year 1694. England was at war with France. Again. William III needed money. The treasury was empty. A Scottish merchant named William Paterson approached the Crown with a proposition. He would organise a syndicate of wealthy merchants to lend the king £1.2 million at 8% interest. In exchange, the syndicate received a royal charter to operate as a bank, the right to issue notes, and a guarantee backed by future tax revenue. The Bank of England opened its doors that same year. The British state had just invented something new, the ability to spend money it did not yet have, secured by money it had not yet collected, from citizens who had not yet earned it. The government bond was born, and with it, the architecture of the modern world. France copied the model within a generation. The Dutch refined it. Alexander Hamilton, the first United States Treasury Secretary, used it in 1790 to absorb the Revolutionary War debt of individual states into a single federal obligation. Deliberately, strategically, because he understood that a nation able to borrow is a nation able to project power. Debt wasn't a mark of weakness, it was the instrument of empire. The battlefield became the balance sheet. It still is. 3 centuries later, the mechanics are unrecognizable. The scale is not. The United States Treasury issues bonds. Banks buy them. The Federal Reserve buys them from the banks, creating new dollars in the process. American taxpayers fund the interest. That interest flows into pension accounts, insurance reserves, money market funds, all of them American. Roughly 2/3 of America's publicly held debt sits inside America itself. The $38 trillion figure looks like a cliff. Looked at differently, it's a mirror. China holds approximately $800 billion of US debt. That sounds enormous until you calculate it against the total. It represents roughly 2%. 2%. The narrative of America shackled to Beijing collapses on contact with the actual number. What China holds is leverage, not control. There is a difference. Japan holds around $1 trillion. Japan also carries its own national debt at 260% of GDP, a figure that would have triggered sovereign default in any lesser economy 20 years ago. Tokyo has been rolling that debt over for 3 decades. Bond yields remain near zero. The market has not panicked. The reason is critical. Japan owes almost entirely to its own citizens through postal savings accounts and domestic pension funds. The yen-denominated debt loop stays closed. The promise stays internal. That distinction, internal debt versus external debt, is the difference between a manageable burden and an existential one. When Greece borrowed externally in euros it could not print, at rates it could not control, to fund deficits its economy could not sustain. The creditors became visible almost overnight. In 2010, bond yields on Greek 10-year debt hit 12%, then 15%, then nearly 30%. The European Central Bank and the IMF arrived with a rescue package. The terms: pension cuts, public sector layoffs, tax increases, and an austerity regime that shrank the Greek economy by 25% over 5 years, a contraction comparable in scale to the American Great Depression. An entire generation of Greeks entered adulthood into an economy that had been restructured not by elected officials, but by bond markets and the institutions that manage them. In Sri Lanka in 2022, the government ran out of foreign currency entirely, not because it overspent on warfare or social programs alone, but because it accumulated external dollar-denominated debt, then watched its export earnings collapse during the pandemic. Fuel queues stretched for miles. The president fled the country. The IMF arrived. New loans replaced old ones. The machine restarted under different management. Same logic. When the system breaks, the creditors stop being abstract. They have names, offices, and terms of service. But here is what those crises reveal about the system in its normal state. Debt was never designed to be repaid. Not at the sovereign level. Not in the 21st century. When you take a mortgage, the bank expects principal back. When Japan issues a 30-year government bond, no one in the transaction believes the Japanese government will retire that obligation from tax revenue. The plan is refinancing, issuing new debt to service old debt, indefinitely, in perpetuity, until either the economy grows large enough to make the ratio manageable, or confidence collapses fast enough to make it catastrophic. Interest is the product, not repayment. This is not conspiracy, it is policy. Ray Dalio spent decades mapping the long-term debt cycles that produce this logic. Economies expand, leverage builds, asset prices rise, and eventually the debt load exceeds the economy's ability to service it through income alone. At that point, governments have four tools: austerity, growth, inflation, or restructuring. Austerity is politically lethal. Growth is slow. Inflation erodes the real value of the debt quietly, transferring wealth from savers to debtors without a visible transaction. Most governments choose inflation eventually, which is why every major currency in history has lost purchasing power over time, and why the dollar today buys roughly 4 cents of what it bought in 1913, the year the Federal Reserve opened. The money in your wallet is not value stored, it is debt acknowledged. Every dollar bill in circulation represents a liability on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, an obligation created when the Fed bought an asset, typically a government bond, and issued currency in exchange. There is no dollar that exists outside this loop. There is no debt-free money. The entire monetary system rests on a chain of promises, each one secured by another, all of them ultimately anchored to the belief that the entity at the top of the chain, the US government, the Federal Reserve, will continue to function, tax, and honor its obligations. Confidence is not sentiment. It is the load-bearing wall of the global economy. That is why the circularity matters. Japan lends to the United States by holding treasury bonds. The United States lends to Europe through the International Monetary Fund. Europe lends to developing nations through the World Bank and bilateral arrangements. Developing nations park their foreign exchange reserves back into Western bonds, completing the circuit. Every node in the network simultaneously holds someone else's IOU and issues its own. The global financial system is not a pyramid with creditors at the top and debtors at the bottom. It is a lattice, each node dependent on the stability of every other. The danger is not any single default. The danger is contagion, the moment participants lose confidence in the lattice itself. We have seen partial versions of this. The 2008 financial crisis began not with sovereign debt, but with American mortgage bonds, securities that the rating agencies Moody's and Standard & Poor's had stamped with AAA ratings, the same designation given to US Treasuries. When the underlying mortgages defaulted, the bonds collapsed. The banks holding them became insolvent overnight, and credit markets seized globally within weeks. Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy on September 15, 2008, with $613 billion in debt. The US government spent $700 billion in the first rescue package alone, and the Federal Reserve ultimately injected over $16 trillion in emergency liquidity across the system. The number was so large that most people simply could not process it. That is how the system defends itself. When the lattice cracks, the institutions at the center print money, buy the broken assets, and restart the loop. But here is what the system cannot paper over: the distributional question. When we say nations owe debt to themselves, that is only arithmetically true. Interest payments do not flow evenly. They flow upward, from taxpayers and wage earners to the institutions and individuals that hold the debt. A pension fund manager in Zurich collecting coupon payments on US treasuries, and a factory worker in Ohio paying federal income tax are both participating in the same system. They are not experiencing it the same way. That is why global wealth inequality and global debt have risen in parallel for 40 years. The system rewards ownership of debt instruments. It charges everyone else for the stability those instruments provide. Creditors are not villains in this story. Debtors are not simply victims. But the distribution of cost and benefit is not accidental. It is structural. And the structure is now under stress that is qualitatively different from previous cycles. The United States added more debt between 2020 and 2024 than it accumulated in its first 200 years of existence. Global debt crossed $300 trillion in 2023 for the first time in history. Central banks spent a decade holding interest rates near zero to keep the system solvent, then raised them sharply to combat inflation, which meant that governments rolling over old cheap debt suddenly faced new expensive debt. The United States now spends more on interest payments annually than it spends on its military. $1 trillion a year, just to maintain the existing obligations. That number will not go down. It will only rise. The world is not heading toward a single catastrophic default. History does not work that cleanly. What it is heading toward is a series of smaller breaks in peripheral nodes, nations that borrowed in currencies they cannot print, at rates they cannot control, for growth that did not materialize. Each break will be managed, restructured, refinanced. The IMF will arrive. New terms will be set. The machine will restart. Until, one day, a break happens close enough to the center that management becomes impossible. William Patterson's 1694 bargain was elegant. Lend the king money, receive a stream of interest forever, secured by the king's power to tax. 330 years later, the entire planet runs on that same bargain, scaled by a factor of millions. The creditor is everywhere. The debtor is everyone. And the only thing standing between the current architecture and its collapse is the continued belief, by billions of people who have never read a government bond prospectus, that the promise will hold. The Weimar housewife's barrow of banknotes was once a promise too. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.